cranial nerve exit rule here. We're removing the brainstem from the ventral view, right? Now you can see that this is basically the pons. You can see this is the medulla oblongata. This area is the midbrain, and then the diencephalon cannot really be viewed here, but technically above this is the diencephalon, and these are the cerebral hemispheres, and this is the cerebellum on both sides. Anyways, so the cranial nerve exit rule follows that four cranial nerves are above the pons. So cranial nerve 1 here, cranial nerve 2, cranial nerve 3, and 4. Remember that cranial nerve 4 is the only nerve, this trochlear nerve, the cranial nerve 4 is the only nerve that basically arises dorsally and immediately decussates. Let me show it to you properly here. So this is your cranial nerve 1, this is the cranial nerve 2, right? And then we have the cranial nerve 3 here, and this is the cranial nerve 4. So basically, cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, is the only nerve that emerges from dorsally, from behind the brainstem. Now, the cranial nerve 3, you can see this cranial nerve 3 here. This basically emerges from the interpeduncular fossa in the midbrain. So, in the midbrain, where you have the two segmental peduncles, in between the peduncles, you have the interpeduncular fossa. The cranial nerve 4, I told you it's special because it exits dorsally and decussates completely. This is why your slide says that basically it arises dorsally and immediately decussates, right? And now we come to this pons. Now, for pons, you remember that four cranial nerves exit the pons, the cranial nerve 5, 6, 7, and 8. So you can see the cranial nerve 5 here. This is your trigeminal nerve. This has three further branches, the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandible. Then you have cranial nerve 6, which is the abducens nerve, right? And then cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve, and cranial nerve 8 later on, right? So cranial nerve I want you to, and this is basically the vestibular. Cranial nerve 8 is your vestibulocochlear nerve, right? Okay, so one thing I wanted to show you was that your cranial nerve 7 and 8, you can see this cranial nerve 7 and 8 almost leave together at the cerebellopontine area, the cerebellopontine angle. This is why if a vestibular schwannoma happens, it affects the cranial nerve 8 first, and then it affects the cranial nerve 7 because they almost leave together at the cerebellopontine angle. The cranial nerve 6, you can see the abducens one, it emerges at this pontomedullary junction, which is close to midline. When I say pontomedullary, basically it's the junction between the pons and the medulla. And the cranial nerve 5 here, this is the largest cranial nerve and it comes off the lateral pons, right? And then we go and see the medulla beneath it. So when you look at this medulla beneath it, you see that cranial nerve 9, 10, 11, and 12 are coming off the medulla. So this cranial nerve 9, 10, 11, and 12 are coming off the medulla. Cranial nerve 12 basically exits between the pyramid and the olive. So let's find our cranial nerve 12. See, you can see this here. So this cranial nerve exits between the pyramid and the olive, right? And this is basically called the pre-olivary sulcus because it is just before the olive, right here. And then the rest of them exit behind the olive. The cranial nerve 9, 10, and 11, you can see they're coming behind the olive from the post-olivary sulcus. So there's a pre-olivary sulcus where the cranial nerve 12 is coming off from, and the post-olivary, the pre-olivary sulcus, the cranial nerve 12 is coming off of it, and the post-olivary sulcus, the cranial nerve 9, 10, and 11 are coming off behind it. Okay, so this is a little bit about the cranial nerves. Let me just repeat that here so you can see this better. So this is your pre-olivary sulcus where your hypoglossal nerve, the cranial nerve 12 is coming off of. And then the rest, the cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal, the 10 and 11, the vagus nerve and the spinal accessory nerve, they're all coming off behind the olives, right? They're coming off from the post-olivary sulcus, right? So this is, if you want to revise this picture, you can stop here and revise this image again. Okay, then we have to see the dorsal view of the brainstem here. This is the dorsal view of the brainstem. You can see the pineal gland here. The pineal gland is basically the gland that produces melatonin. The function of melatonin is to regulate your circadian rhythm, your sleep-wake cycle, basically, right? And then you have the superior and inferior colliculus. I remember whenever we talk about the superior and inferior colliculus, we talk about the lightning and thunder. So superior colliculus is lightning and inferior colliculus is thunder, because superior colliculus is related to vision. It controls eye movements, visual reflexes, and tracking moving objects. Example, if you see a bird, your eyes turn automatically because of the superior colliculus. And for the inferior colliculus, you think about hearing. The auditory reflex center is in the inferior colliculus, right? So example, you hear a loud horn, your head turns, this is the inferior colliculus. So a memory trick could be to remember superior inferior by lightning and thunder. Okay, and then you have the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellar peduncles basically connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. If I cut off the cerebellar peduncles, basically the cerebellum will be lost to reality. The superior peduncle is at the level of the midbrain, the middle peduncle is at the level of the pons, and the inferior peduncle is at the level of the medulla. So this is basically your midbrain, pons, and medulla is your brainstem right in front of the cerebellum, right? So midbrain connects the superior, the superior peduncle connects the midbrain to the cerebellum behind. The middle peduncle connects the pons to the cerebellum behind, and the medulla connects the inferior peduncle connects the medulla to the cerebellum behind. Then we have the cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, in order to understand these cranial nerve nuclei, let me take you to a picture here. Yeah, so you can see a few of the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem here. So the nuclei are not where the nerves exit; they are inside the tegmentum. When we studied the brainstem, we studied the tectum, tegmentum, and certain other parts, right? Floor of the fourth ventricle and so on. So the tegmentum is like the marrow, the innermost part of the brainstem, right, in the midbrain and pons. So we studied the tegmentum, which was basically the back part of the brainstem. Now they are inside the tegmentum. The cranial nerve nuclei are inside the tegmentum. You can see that in the midbrain area, you have cranial nerve 3 and 4 nuclei. So you have the oculomotor nucleus here, you have the trochlear nucleus here, trochlear nucleus here, right? And in the pons, you have, so in this pons section, you have the cranial nerve 5 nucleus. So trigeminal nerve has this principal nucleus, which we also call the chief sensory nucleus. It also has this mesencephalic nucleus. It also has a motor nucleus. So all these nucleus are part of creating the fibers for the trigeminal nucleus. And you also have the abducens, the cranial nerve 6 nucleus. You also have the facial nucleus here, right? And you also have the vestibular nucleus, which is your cranial nerve 8 here. Also, can you see the trigeminal nerve? You also have the spinal nucleus here, right? So trigeminal nerve takes fibers from the spinal nucleus, from the mesencephalic nucleus, from the principal nucleus, from the motor nucleus. A lot of nucleus add up to give fibers to one nerve, right? And then you can see that in the medullary region, this is the medulla. You can see that the cranial nerve 9, 10, and 12 basically have their nucleuses here. So the hypoglossal nucleus is present here. The vagal dorsal nucleus of X is present here. Nucleus ambiguous is present here, right? Again, when we talk about the vagal nerve, I need to remind you that the vagal nerve takes fibers from more than 2 or 3 nucleuses. So it's not anything special that one cranial nerve is taking fibers from more than one nucleus. Okay, so cranial nerve nuclei, just to remember, overall they're located in tegmentum portion of the brain stem between the dorsal and the ventral portion. Um, the cranial nerve nuclei in the midbrain, we saw that the cranial nerve 3 and 4 nucleus is present. In pons, the cranial nerve nuclei of 5, 6, 7, and 8 were present. It will be helpful for you to stop here and kind of memorize all these cranial nerve names and nuclei. Otherwise, it will be difficult for you to follow when I tell you where the nuclei are. In anatomy class, we technically make the students learn the brain sections at different levels. That kind of helps you put uh, so at the pons level, you have the nuclei of cranial nerve 5, 6, 7, and 8. At the medulla level, you have the nuclei of cranial nerve 9, 10, and 12. And in the spinal cord, you have the nucleus of cranial nerve 11. Right? Now, something special about the cranial nerve and vessel pathways, it's important for you to know where the motor neurons actually begin. Now, cranial nerve 11 is a little special. Okay, when we come to cranial nerve 11, let me spend 1 minute there and tell you that look at all of these other cranial nerves, they have the nuclei in the midbrain, pons, and medulla. But the cranial nerve 11 is special. Why? Because the motor neurons of cranial nerve 11, this is basically your accessory nerve. It's special because the motor neurons actually begin in the C1 to C5 levels of spinal cord. They ascend, they go up, these fibers go up through the foramen magnum and leave through the jugular foramen. Okay, so I'm going to show you the jugular foramen here. See, so this is the jugular foramen, right? And the jugular foramen, you can see that the cranial nerve 11 exits from here. 9, 10, and 9, 10 are also exiting from here only, but it's important to remember that 11 is also coming off from it, right? And then there's a sulcus limitans rule. This is the embryological favorite MCQ kind of a thing that the neural tube, you remember, it divides into the alar plate and the basal plate, right? So the alar plate produces the sensory nuclei and the basal plate produces the motor nuclei. Therefore, what happens is the lateral becomes the sensory and the medial becomes the motor. Let me show it to you. So during embryology, we saw the sulcus limitans, right, when the fourth ventricle was developing. So at the fourth ventricle, the dorsal sensory plate and motor and the ventral motor plate was developing, right? So you can see this is your sensory area and this is your motor area, right? So what happens is that the dorsal sensory plate becomes the lateral sensory plate, right? And the ventral motor plate becomes the medial motor plate. So with M, you can remember that it becomes the medial, M is for medial and motor, and the sensory plate was your lateral plate, which was originally the dorsal sensory plate. That is something I want you to remember embryologically. Right. Okay. And then we move on to our exits of the brainstem, where they're coming off from. So these are foramina of the skull, right? All these little holes that are present, they're very important. First and foremost, you have the cribriform plate here. The cribriform plate is more like a sieve-like plate. It's part of the ethmoid bone, and it has these little lots of very small holes. And the olfactory vessels, the olfactory nerves pass through it. Okay, so the cranial nerve one is coming off of the cribriform plate for smell. Cranial one is for smell, right? And this is obviously your anterior cranial fossa. The yellow part is your middle cranial fossa, mostly formed by the sphenoidal bone. And the anterior cranial fossa is formed through the ethmoid bone, and the posterior cranial fossa is through the temporal or occipital bone. So here you have the temporal bone, here you have occipital bone. And then you have the optic canal, cranial nerve 2. This is your optic canal. Can you see this here? This is the optic canal. And the optic canal basically lodges your cranial nerve 2 and the ophthalmic artery. I told you that the ophthalmic artery helps to spread infections from the face up to the brain. And then we have the superior orbital fissure here. This is the laterally invaginating long kind of superior orbital fissure. So it has a lot of things going off of from it. The cranial nerve 3, 4, 6, and the first branch of trigeminal nerve. The 3, 4, 6, and first branch of trigeminal nerve, all four of these structures pass through the superior orbital fissure. And then you have the foramen rotundum. The foramen rotundum, ovale, and spinosum are present just side by side. So this is rotundum, this is ovale, and this is spinosum. So foramen rotundum lodges this um, okay, foramen rotundum basically lodges your second branch of trigeminal nerve. The foramen ovale lodges your third branch of trigeminal nerve. So let me just tell you that the first branch was the ophthalmic nerve, the second branch was the maxillary nerve, and the third branch was the mandibular nerve. And then your foramen spinosum branches the middle meningeal artery. Then we have the internal, just for memory, you can remember that the 3, 4, V1 and okay, I'll come back to this memory part later. We have done foramen rotundum, right? Foramen rotundum basically had the second branch of the trigeminal nerve, ovale had the third branch, and then we came on to the spinosum, which had the middle meningeal artery. Then we have the internal auditory meatus or the acoustic meatus, right? So in the posterior cranial fossa, you have this internal auditory meatus where you have the cranial nerve 7 and 8 coming off from, which is your facial nerve and your vestibulocochlear nerve. I told you that whenever The a vestibular schwannoma affects the cranial nerve 8 very quickly. It goes on to affect the cranial nerve 7 also because they're both emerging at the cerebellopontine angle. Then we have the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen is where the 9, 10, and 11, all of them are coming off of from. 11, I told you, it takes roots from the spinal cord C1 to C5 from below, and they ascend up and form enter the foramen magnum and form the spinal accessory nerve to exit again from the jugular foramen, right? Then we have the hypoglossal canal. By its name, you know that the hypoglossal nerve is exiting from it, right? Very easy to remember the hypoglossal canal. And then we have the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is where the entire brain stem is exiting from. The spinal root of cranial nerve 11 is going up, ascending up from the foramen magnum, and some vertebral arteries, right? So the vertebral arteries basically come off of from the subclavian arteries, and then the two vertebral arteries join around the brainstem to form the basilar artery. And these vertebral arteries basically give you the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, right? These vertebral arteries, and then they form the basilar artery and become the posterior cerebral artery, right? Cranial nerve functions, a little bit about cranial nerve functions. Now, technically, we do these cranial nerve functions in a lot of detail, but I'll stop here because the video is getting very long. I'll do the cranial nerve functions in the next video. So this is a little bit of an introduction to the cranial nerve nuclei, the brain stem, and where they're exiting from.